And I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues at the Japan Committee in the Center of East Asian Studies, or the sponsors of today's talk. Before we introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the man whom this lecture series honors at Showa. Professor Najita is Robert Ingersoll Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of History and of East Asian Languages and Civilizations. He received his BA at Grinnell College, his PhD at Harvard University, and he joined the faculty of the University of Chicago in 1969. He's a specialist in 18th century Tokugawa thought, the history of early, modern, and modern Japan, and the intellectual history of political economy in Japan. But we just had Professor Najita in my graduate seminar, and I think he's a specialist in everything. Our discussion ranged across literature, ethics, philosophy, anthropology. It's very hard to pin him down. He's a slippery kind of fellow as a scholar. He has published 18 books, either author or poet books, both in English and Japanese. He has nearly 100 articles in print, both in English and Japanese. His 1967 book, Harake, The Politics of Compromise, was awarded the John King Fairbank Prize in East Asian History. His 1987 book, Visions of Virtue, The Kaito Merchant Academy of Osaka, won the Yamagata Ranko Prize. He retired, supposedly, from the University of Chicago in 2002, but remains a very active force in our field. His most recent book, Ordinary Economies in Japan, A Historical Perspective, was published in 2009 by the University of California Press. And today he attended not only my seminar, but also Professor Jim Kedlar's seminar, and was the most energetic, lively, and interesting person in the room, I'm sure, in both places. He was in my room. In addition to being a great scholar, Professor Najita served both the University of Chicago and the field of Asian Studies in many ways over his long and distinguished career. He was the director of the Center for East Asian Studies. He was the chair of the History Department here at the University of Chicago and the master of the Social Sciences Division. He was the president of the Association for Asian Studies. All of those distinguished accomplishments, I think, still don't give you a sense for what Professor Najita has meant for people who do the kind of scholarship I do. What Professor Najita and his colleagues and his students did here at the University of Chicago in the field of Japanese studies and intellectual history in North America was simply they raised the bar. And the impact of the work that they did was felt very widely across the country, across the world, and in many different disciplines. Those of you who were here last year for the distinguished Najita lecture by Nobel Prize-winning novelist Roy Kinsaburo heard him speak in very moving terms about the direct impact that Professor Najita's writings have had on his own novels and on his own understanding of his family's history. I felt the impact of Professor Najita's work first when I was a graduate student at Yale University in the early 1990s, and we heard all of this amazing music coming out of the University of Chicago. And I met Professor Najita for the first time when he came to Grinnell in, I think, 1990 or 1991 for a conference on Ando Shoeki. I was a second-year graduate student, and I think I bent his ear for about a half hour with a crackpot theory about a relationship between Ando Shoeki's 18th century work in Japan and the early Marxist theories on the division of labor. He heard me out very patiently, and then in the kindest possible way told me what I was for. Professor Najita's work changed the way that we study East Asia. It brought a new critical edge as well as an insistence that history must be both rigorous in its scholarship and self-reflexive in its ethical stance. Professor Najita's students went out into the world and conquered. It seems to me, when I look around my field, that every interesting, worthwhile book in the last 20 or 30 years comes from someone that was trained here at the University of Chicago, or at best, someone who's trained by someone who's trained at the University of Chicago. Looking at Professor Najita's enormous legacy, I sometimes can't help but feel that sometimes we're still living off the intellectual capital that he accumulated here during his long career. We're also more literally living off the actual capital that he raised as a tireless fundraiser for the University of Chicago. The Japan Committee today, every year, funds dozens of graduate students, faculty research projects, public lectures, conferences, art exhibitions, musical performances, film screenings, all of it thanks to our endowment, most of which was raised by Professor Najita. We owe a great deal to Professor Najita, and we are delighted that he and Eleanor are here with us again today for this, what I think will be a wonderful evening. Please join me in welcoming and recognizing Professor Tetsuo and Eleanor Najita today, and thanking them for everything that they've done for us. I mentioned earlier that the impact that Professor Najita's students have had on my field, and it's my pleasure now to introduce one of those students, one of those scholars that came out of Chicago that helped raise the bar in the field in the study of Japanese history. Professor Susan Burns of the Departments of History and East Asian Languages and Civilizations will now take the podium and introduce our distinguished speaker.
Najita had a distinguished lecture series is an event that is very close to my heart because it honors Tetsuo Najita, who was my dissertation advisor and is one of the most important influences on my own work as a teacher and a researcher of Japanese history. And of course, now that I am on faculty here, I am literally occupying his shoes because his former office is my office, and every time I walk in, I feel like I'm being mantled. This year's lecture, however, has a special meaning for me because our speaker, Professor Koyasu Nobukuni, is another one of my teachers. From 1990 to 1992, as a graduate student, I was a research fellow at Osaka University, and Professor Koyasu was my host professor. Now, during those 2 years, I was a weekly participant in Professor Koyasu's seminar in Japanese intellectual history. And for much of my stay, that seminar was devoted to reading Nobukuni Koyasu's Fujikiden, a late 18th century study of the 8th century mythical history of Fujiki, which was at the center of my dissertation project, and he kindly made it the center of his seminar, I think, because I was coming. Like many graduate students, I arrived in Japan with a great plan that I was not fully prepared to execute. Professor Koyasu, however, gracefully endured my stumbling efforts to read and make sense of this challenging task. He also kindly allowed me to present on what I can only call the most interesting bits of the Fujikiden. It's a very long book, and there are some boring parts, but he allowed me to pick up the really challenging, interesting parts. And after my presentation, he often offered the comment, "Omoshiroi," or interesting, which I then regarded as very high praise, but now accompanied, like I said, a bit more measured. I was able, during my 2 years at Osaka, to witness firsthand the qualities that have made Professor Koyasu one of the best-known historians and public intellectuals in Japan today. His dedication to life as an intellectual and a scholar, his intense ethical engagement with the political issues of the day, and his remarkable record of scholarly production, marked by critical rigor, careful research, and expansive knowledge. Born in Kanazawa Prefecture in 1933, not far from Tokyo, Professor Koyasu was educated at Tokyo University in the Department of Ethics, a department that was reflective of the pre-war approach to the study of intellectual history. It later became the object of his sustained critique. Much of his career was spent at Osaka University, where he trained a new generation of intellectual historians, including quite a few international students like myself, from the US, but also from China, Taiwan, and Korea. He has authored upwards of 40 books, many of which I've been trying to count them today, and it's pretty challenging. And many of these have been translated into either Korean or Chinese, and he frequently travels around East Asia, delivering lectures in forums like this one. In the 1980s and 1990s, Professor Koyasu was primarily engaged with the study of the intellectual discourse of the Tokugawa or early modern period, in a series of works on influential intellectuals such as Jinsai, Ogisodai, Nobukuni Koyasu, and Hinata Asakani. He worked to rethink early modern thought outside the confines of the pre-war paradigm of ethics on the one hand and the post-war paradigm of modernization theory on the other hand. In the last decade, his work has focused on post-war and contemporary Japan, particularly on issues of Japanese nationalism, the legacy of the pre-war and wartime state, and what he calls Japanese Orientalism. He's currently working on a book that interrogates Japanese perceptions of China and the Chinese, and he's sharing part of that work with us today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nobukuni Koyasu to the University of Chicago.
今回成田先生の特別講座にお招きいただきまして大変感謝いたしております。
Thank you for inviting me as a lecturer for the Tetsuo Najita Distinguished Lecture Series today. In November of 1989, I was given the opportunity to give several lectures on Tokugawa here at the University of Chicago. And the fact that I've been given this opportunity today is very moving to me. 22 years ago, it was quite cold when I came to Chicago. And I had a very severe impression of Chicago before coming here this time again. But he discovered that it was a very green and wonderful place here at the university. I've taught in Japan for 40 years, and when you teach in Japan for 40 years, you develop this habit of standing when you're lecturing. And this is because the students in Japan don't really listen very well to your lectures, so you end up standing and talking really down at them. And I believe that everyone here will really listen to what I have to say and pay attention, but nevertheless, I'm going to stand and lecture today. And I also, secondly, have this habit of going off the script that I prepared for the lecture. So what ends up happening is the interpreter, like myself, ends up crying during the lecture. But apparently thinks I'm a very calm person and I'll be able to handle it. So bear with me, please. I do work in intellectual history, and Professor Najita's work was something that sort of revolutionized the field of intellectual history and had a big impact on my work. Professor Najita became famous in Japan as the author of the book on the Kaitokudo, and it's hard for me to talk about the impact of Professor Najita without talking a little bit about what the Kaitokudo is and what it means. As you can tell from the book title, the Kaitokudo, the Merchant Academy, the Kaitokudo was a school built by merchants in Osaka. And for us studying here at the University of Chicago, built by the Rockefellers, this might be something that seems quite obvious. But what's significant about the Kaitokudo Academy is that it was built in 18th century Japan. Not only a school built by merchants in Osaka, but a school built for merchants in Osaka. But he wants to really talk about the intellectual historical significance of Professor Najita's work. Before Professor Najita's book came out, scholars in Japan knew that very famous and very great intellectuals came out of the Kaitokudo Academy, but they didn't really study the academy as a place of significance and the intellectual activity that was going on there. In fact, the Kaitokudo was studied as a part of economic history, and Professor Najita was the first to really study it from the perspective of intellectual history. For example, the great intellectual historian Maruyama Masao doesn't even mention the Kaitokudo, and in fact just mentions one of the scholars that came out of there for just one line. So what Professor Najita did was to bring this Merchant Academy into the intellectual history, and Professor Koyasu really sees this as an event in the legacy of intellectual history as it's done in Japan and elsewhere. And he really wants to stress this eventfulness of this book. I was trying to remember when I first met Professor Najita at Osaka University, and speaking to Professor Najita yesterday, he reminded me that it was in 1984. And this is fairly important to me because the Kaitokudo, the book itself, didn't come out until 1987, a few years after that meeting. So this in fact means that it was over 25 years ago that I met Professor Najita, over a quarter of a century ago. To explain a little bit why I wrote these years down is that after meeting Professor Najita in 1988, I visited Beijing, but in 1989 the Tiananmen Square happened, and then in 1990 is the year he came to Chicago to visit, and that's when the Berlin Wall fell. So this time was a very time of great change in world history at the time. So I was working on reforming the methods of intellectual history in parallel with these great changes that were happening in world history at the time. And the person who gave me the impulse, I guess, to do this was Professor Najita.
でその最初にですから
When I met Professor Najita in 1984, maybe Professor Najita had already written the greater part of the Merchant Academy already. But when I met him then, he really was talking to me passionately about the contents of this work. And what he was talking about there was the networks of knowledge in 18th century Japan. But I couldn't really understand what he was talking about at all, as much as I tried to listen. And what Professor Najita was trying to impress upon me at that time was the spatial aspects of knowledge. And since, as an intellectual historian, I have this tendency to think along the temporal axis when I'm thinking about intellectual history, I had a really difficult time understanding what he was trying to say. Professor Najita interrupted the simple linear writing of intellectual history and discovered a new form of knowledge and their movements that exist in the spatial expanse of society. These movements of knowledge develop in a manner overlapping with networks between people and things. 18th century society during the Tokugawa era was a society in which the networks encompassing people, things, and knowledge were formed on the scale of the entire country. And the commercial capital of Osaka was an important node in the networks between people and things in 18th century Japan. This also means that Osaka was an important node in the network of knowledge. In other words, that the Kaitokudo, a place of learning in Osaka, was an anchorage of knowledge of the utmost importance. In this way, Professor Najita rediscovered the Kaitokudo. And that is not all. He rediscovered Japan's early modern society, or Tokugawa Japan. And in this way, my own rewriting of Edo-era intellectual history was accelerated. Japan in the Tokugawa era is made up of 3 urban centers. We have Tokyo and Kyoto and Osaka. And then, of course, across the country there are local castle towns where the big samurai were settled, such as in Sendai up here, where the tsunami recently hit, and also in Hakata down in Kyushu. And what happened in the Tokugawa era was all of these places were tied together with a transportation network of roads. And not only that, there was a lot of commerce going on in the inland sea as well. But what was revolutionary about Professor Najita's work was that in the past, historians really concentrated on Tokyo as a center of a political network. And of course, people knew that Osaka was the center of the economic network. But what Professor Najita suggested was that there was also a network of knowledge that was happening throughout this new transportation network that was happening, and that Osaka was also the center of that network of knowledge. So what was revolutionary about Professor Najita's work was that he rediscovered this map of early modern Japan that was completely different from the map that we know of modern Japan. And the map of modern Japan puts Tokyo at the center of everything. But in the early modern Japan, you can see that there are a much more decentralized network that also puts the center of knowledge in Osaka and develops from there. I could spend all my time talking about this stuff, but one thing that I discovered from reading Professor Najita's book was that in Kyushu, down here, there was a scholar of cosmology named Miura Bayan. And until Kaitokudo came out, intellectual historians took him as sort of a genius, partly because they couldn't figure out why he was coming up with these brilliant ideas. But after reading Kaitokudo, I visited Miura Bayan's house in Kyushu and stood on the beach by his house by Beppu. And if you stand at the sea, you can see that it's a there's a one-way direct route by sea to Osaka. And then he realized that he wasn't an isolated scholar. He was actually directly connected to Osaka. And this I wouldn't have realized unless I read Professor Najita's book.
というわけでこの成田さんの指摘っていうのはやっぱり
So this kind of spatial understanding of intellectual history really changed the way that we understand intellectual history. But not only that, it really changed the way that we understand the modern. If we take the Edo period, the Tokugawa period up here, and the Meiji period, or the modern period down here, what was usually done is that we understood the Edo period by looking back into the Edo or Tokugawa period. And what changed here is that it was a complete switch in the way that we understand it. Instead of doing that, we started looking from the Edo period to understand the modern period. So it was a switch in perspective that Professor Koyasu pursued in his own work. And he calls this taking Edo as method.
ちょうどこの1990年っていう
So in 1990, I wrote a book called Sorai Studies as Events. And what I did there, Ogio Sorai was a scholar in the Edo period, theorist of politics. And what I did there was, I guess, a critique of Maruyama Masao, the intellectual historian. And while Maruyama Masao takes Sorai as a precursor to the modern, instead what I did was I took this switch in perspective and tried to understand the modern from the perspective of Sorai.
でそれ以後私は90年以降もっぱら
Since that period, I've been continuing to reread the modern from such perspectives, and including that, I've done a study of aspects such as the Yasukuni Shrine in a book about state and ritual. I've also written a book on what is overcoming modernity. This book right here. And but now I'm beginning to think about the emergence of China as a great power and thinking about how China was thought about by intellectuals in Japan.
ちょうどやった中国
So
の
now I can finally start talking about China.
中国はですね日本
So that China, from the perspective of Japan, is a foreign country, both culturally and linguistically speaking. When does such an idea come about? Of course, during times of crisis like war, it's a pretty obvious fact that they are, it might seem like an obvious fact that they're foreign countries. But in times of peace, when does such an idea come about? It might seem like something that happened a long time ago, but in fact, it's quite a new idea.
日本がね
So if we consider that Japan as a state, as a sort of conscious state, was established in around the year 700, this is quite recent. For example, if you consider that Confucius was around 500 BC, that's about 1,200 years before Japan came about. So if you think about it, when Japan was born as a state, China had always already been there. And it's important to think that for Japan, China is always already there.
もうすでにある中国を
So when you consider that for Japan, that China was always already there really can't be this idea that Japan is a foreign country vis-a-vis China. So going from there, when you think about Japan being a country that is linguistically derived from China and culturally derived from China. So this idea that China is a foreign country is somewhat of a strange phenomenon, and it's a quite recent event that this happened. And when you think about along those lines, the phenomenon of Japan emerging, or this thought of Japan as a country in itself, or original country, and China as a foreign country, has to happen at the same time, simultaneously.
日本というものをですから当然これは一種の
So this is really the beginning of nationalism in Japan. And Japan's first nationalist, the nativist Motoori Norinaga, was the first to articulate this Japan as a country in itself, and also China as a foreign country.
このだけどね
Motoori Norinaga is famous as the person who annotated Japan's oldest records, the Kojiki.
この古事記というのはですね
Motoori Norinaga's work, in a sense, is very paradoxical, and let me explain a little bit about that. The Kojiki, the oldest records from Japan, was established in about 712, and the Nihon Shoki, another one of those scripts was written a little bit after that. And like I said earlier, this was around the same time of the establishment of the first state. But what Norinaga tried to do was find something originally Japanese from the script that was written in Chinese characters from Chinese language. So he's trying to find a Japanese language from this very ancient text that is written in Chinese language. So it's a very paradoxical thing that he's attempting to do here. So in a sense, Norinaga is doing something that seems very dubious, a very dubious task here. But through this task of finding something Japanese in these texts written in Chinese, what he's doing is he's expelling the Chineseness from these texts and trying to bring out sort of Japaneseness from it. So through that process, China becomes something that can be called foreign.
でこれが
So as this original Japan is sort of being discovered by Motori Norinaga, at the same time in Osaka, the Merchant Academy of the Kaitokudo is also flourishing. So this is all happening at the same time.
このですから異国化
In the background of this, there is also this intellectual impact of the switch from the Ming dynasty to the Qing dynasty in China.
で、この問
But I
題
could go on and on about this too, so now we'll move on to the discourse on China in the modern
近
period.
代へで
We're sort of running out of time, so without using the whiteboard, I'll start reading from the
ここで
lecture
こういう
notes.
説明を抜きに日本の為政者自社に
China came to draw the attention of policymakers and intellectuals in Japan to the so-called Western impact that hit East Asia in the 19th
中国が注
century.
意されるとは
That China came to draw attention also means that the West drew attention as well.
1840
The Opium War and China's defeat in 1840 had a major impact on late Tokugawa Japan, and this was a dual-layered impact. The first impact was that given by the national strength of the Western countries, most notably their military might. The second impact was given by the conditions of the great Qing dynasty, which was defeated so soundly by this military might. The young reformers of the Choshu domain were the ones who took this impact with the greatest sense of urgency. Choshu, which was most sensitive to the international situation in East Asia of this time, came to take on a crucial role in Japan's modern revolution.
で明治以降の
How
で
did
すね
Japanese intellectuals understand China once Japan's modern revolution in the Meiji Restoration had been completed in the meantime? And I would like to explore this through my reading of Fukuzawa Yukichi's An Outline of a Theory of Civilization.
数年前に文明論の
Many of you probably are familiar with Fukuzawa Yukichi's An Outline of Theory of Civilization, but there are several important points about this book. The first being that he suggested that Japan's civilizing process should be and is modeled after the Western modernization process.
それで
Here again we have a criticism of Maruyama Masao. Maruyama has a very famous commentary on Fukuzawa's work that we're discussing here, and Maruyama kind of takes on Fukuzawa's thought about the civilization process as his own, and he takes it as the most forward-thinking idea of civilization at that time. But what Professor Koyasu did was he read Fukuzawa's work as sort of the design of how Japan's modernization process should be, how Fukuzawa thought about that. And the way that he read it was to try to understand what was accomplished from that design. What were they able to do, and what weren't they able to do based on that design.
でそれで
So what kind of view of China is derived from this kind of design of civilization process? And what he suggests is that it's a view of China as a stagnant country, a stagnated China.
でこれは
So Professor Koyasu reads
基本的に
Fukuzawa's theory of civilization as a translation of European theories of civilization. And what Fukuzawa does is he inherits just as itself the Orientalism that is inherent in European ideas of civilization.
でこれが実はこの捉え
So
方
what we have here is the idea that Japan is on the side of the West and succeeding in its effort to civilizing, and China is on the other side, being left behind from the civilization process. And what they call this was that's the leaving Asia and joining or entering Europe.
この捉え方が
So this idea of that's new it was the orthodox ideology of modern Japan, and this orthodoxy of this idea continued until 1945.
これ
One more thing that I want to say about Fukuzawa's work on the specific work is that I read Fukuzawa as a translation of these European civilizational theories. And also I like to read this as the process through which the modern Japanese language emerges as a project of translation, and this becomes the orthodox language of modern Japan.
でこれはですね言語論の問題と非常
So
に
if you take a look at my lecture notes, you can see that most of it is made up of Chinese characters as well as Japanese kana characters. And what he wants to say is that the Japanese language was created through this importation of Chinese language and then reworked into Japanese, but it's not possible to exist without the Chinese characters being there in the first place.
日本の近
The
代
modern Japanese language that we are using today emerges as through a translation process.
だから私がここに書いてるのはこれ全部
The words that he's using today that uses Chinese script, such as the word design or stagnation or all these other ones, are actually works of are modern words that comes through translation of European words. And he figures that 90% of these words that he uses, even though they're written in the kanji or Chinese script, are actually European words that have been translated into Japanese.
ですから私は
So basically, I understand the modern Japanese language as a language of translation.
だってこれはね私はね
I don't want to say by any means that this means that Japanese is an inferior language. Rather, it's a very flexible and has a very soft structure that allows these kind of changes to happen.
ただ大事なことはねここで言うのは
But in today's context, the most important thing that I want to impress upon you is that this language of translation of that is modern Japanese language contained within it this differentiation between a progressive Japan and a stagnant China.
でもう一人で先
So moving ahead through the victories in the Russo-Japanese War and the Sino-Japanese War, Japan becomes an imperialist nation.
でアジアにおけ
So
る
what is the significance in our context of our talk today in the establishment of the Japanese Empire? And what I want to say is that in the traditional worldview, China existed as the center of Asia, and the Asian world was built around it. But through the establishment of the Japanese Empire, that center was shifted over to Japan.
これがまさに20世紀の問題
So it attempts to restructure the shape of East Asia through shifting the cultural center of Asia from China to Japan.
ですから伝統
When you read the history of Asian art or the history of Asian religion or history of Asian whatever, usually it's the history of China first and how it developed throughout Asia. But what happened in the 20th century, they tried to rewrite this with taking Japan as a center. And the method that they tried to do this was to say not the history of Chinese art, but the history of East Asian art. So this was the method that they used to switch the center over.
でこの東亜とい
This
う
may come as some surprise, but the geographical concept of East Asia didn't exist prior to the 20th century. You can look in some of the oldest dictionaries of Japan, such as the Genkai, and there you can't find the concept of East Asia or Toa. What you do instead find is concepts like Toyo or Orient, but East Asia is a relatively new geographical concept.
ですから要するに東
So
亜
East Asia is a geographical concept that became necessary once the cultural center was shifted from China to Japan, and through that process, this concept of East Asia became a necessary one.
でここからやがて
So during the war with China, between Japan and China during the Second World War, there's this new political geographical concept called the East Asian Cooperative Body. And this concept of East Asia was was part of this movement of the shift of the center to Japan.
この多摩共同体という
So this idea of the East Asian Cooperative Body was really put forward by what was called the Showa Research Group, which was the think tank of the Konoe Fumimaro Prime Minister's administration. And the intellectuals that were part of this think tank were, in fact, progressive leftist intellectuals. Although they were within the power, the structure of authority, they were considered to be more of the progressive thinkers during that time.
でこの問題自体も
So when we talk about some of the issues that we talked about today, we started thinking about what the idea of China and East Asia really requires of the intellectuals and their work. And with the shift of the power now from Japan to China, we see that intellectuals in China are very much rethinking the concept of East Asia and how the region is constructed under that umbrella. And just as when I talk about the experience of Japanese intellectuals in their work and thinking about East Asia and how it's constructed, I very much have this in mind of the work that is being done and will be done by intellectuals in China going forward.
でもう本当に時間が過ぎましたけど
In closing, I also want to talk a little bit about the war in China during the Second World War, which really brought a tragic end to relations between Japan and China during that time. Here, I've been calling it the Nichu Senso, or the war between Japan and China. But this isn't really the way that it's been called in Japan for a very long time. And in fact, it's been called the China Incident, or Shinajihen instead. And this idea that it wasn't really a war, but just an incident, wasn't just an idea that was forwarded by politicians and leaders, but also was something that was very much held by the general populace as well.
で日中戦争は1937年
So the war in China began in 1937, and the Pacific War began in 1941. But what's really happening between this time was that the war was really getting bogged down with no end in sight whatsoever. And a very famous way to describe the situation was that Japan only had control over the dots and lines. That is to say, Japan had control over the cities and the lines that sort of connected these cities, but that was about it. And in fact, it was a situation really close to a defeat in China.
ですから我々は結局この
So I understand the Pacific War with the United States and England as the Japanese states' attempt to break through the bogged down war in China and to finally put an end to what's going on there.
でところがですね
However, with the beginning of the Pacific War, about 90% of the populace really believed that the real war had finally begun, and they were in fact moved by the beginning of the war.
形式的には中国との
So indeed, there were formal restoration of relations with Japan, between Japan and China, and things like that. But in terms of the people's consciousness of any kind of meaningful resolution, well, that really never happened. Of course, there was the international context of the Civil War in China during that time, and also the Cold War beginning at the same time. So there is that, but in terms of the people's consciousness in Japan, a resolution was never established.
でそれはそれは
And I think this has been a real tragedy for Japan. I mean, the economic ties are being developed constantly, and these are becoming perhaps even stronger. But on the fundamental level, the relationship has never been restored. In fact, the relations is something that I would call somewhat chilly. And there isn't really any sort of neighborly relations between the two countries.
でその理由はもっぱら言われるように
These chilly relations between Japan and China is not just an issue about the way that people understand history, as it's often thought, but more fundamentally a problem about how Japan sees itself in the international system of nations. The crux of the matter is that it completely relies on the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty to understand the issue of security in East Asia. And in order to really think about and to assure the maintenance of security in East Asia, what Japan really needs to do is to rethink its relationship with China. And only through establishing, renewing relations on a fundamental level with China can security be assured in East Asia.
どうも大体100年には
Well, I just went over 100 years of relations between Japan and China in a short time, and this isn't something you can do in an hour or 2 hours, but I hope that you can get some fragments of the problems, however incomplete, from the talk that I gave today. Thank you very much.